Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. A single warning about falling Longan prices before TET was enough to shake an otherwise calm day for Toan and Tu Diem. Caught between money, responsibility and TET preparations, Toan is forced to face his deepest fear. What if he makes the wrong choice? And now let's explore the story of Toan and Tu Diem, where a small decision begins to change everything at home. Will they choose short-term safety or stand by what they truly believe? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The farmyard looked more orderly than usual after the flowers were planted. The soil was still loose, not yet settled, with shovel marks clearly pressed into the red earth. A few gardening tools rested against the porch, left there without urgency. The space was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that felt fully comfortable. It was the pause after a long stretch of work, when the body had slowed, but the mind had not. Toan stood still for a long moment. His eyes followed the line of newly arranged flower pots, each placed at an even distance from the next. He did not step forward to adjust anything. He did not check the soil again. He simply stood there, as if asking himself whether everything was truly in place. Tu Diem moved differently. She bent down to adjust the final plant, pressing the soil gently around its base with care. When she finished, she brushed the dirt from her hands and let out a short breath. A quiet signal that the task was done. The sense of calm had barely formed when it was interrupted by the sound of a motorbike stopping at the gate. The engine cut off cleanly. A familiar sound. A produce buyer they had known for years stepped into the yard. His movements were quick but not rushed. His voice carried the casual tone of someone who no longer needed formal greetings. He did not sit down and he did not circle around the point. He spoke directly. This year, Longan prices were showing signs of dropping. Those who sold early might still get a decent price. Waiting until closer to TET would be uncertain. He did not exaggerate. He did not mention numbers. He simply placed the information there, leaving the weight of it to settle on its own. Tu Diem stayed still, offering no immediate reaction. Toan did not respond right away either. He nodded lightly and said he would think about it. The buyer understood and did not push. He said he would return in the afternoon for a decision, then turned and left. The yard grew quiet again, but the earlier ease did not return. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen had been added to it. After the buyer disappeared from view, Toan took a few slow steps and stopped near Tu Diem. He spoke quietly, his voice low as if speaking more to himself than to her. Selling early would mean having money ready for TET, less to worry about. He did not say it like a decision, only like a thought that had surfaced and refused to leave. Tu Diem did not answer immediately. She looked at the newly planted flowers, each pot standing close to the next, then spoke slowly. Money brings peace in the short term, but selling early means losing the chance to choose later. Her tone was steady. She was not arguing. She simply placed two ways of thinking side by side and let the meaning speak for itself. No one argued. No voices were raised. Yet the difference between them was clear. Toan was used to choosing safety. He disliked leaving things unresolved. For him, money in hand meant certainty. It meant sleeping better at night. Tu Diem was different. She tended to look further ahead. She feared rushed decisions made out of worry, decisions that could shape their lives for years afterward. As midday approached, they decided to go to the market to shop for TET as they had planned. No one mentioned selling the Longan again, but the thought lingered, like a thin thread pulling quietly at every choice. The road to the market was busier than usual. Vendors called out. Buyers moved quickly, all trying to prepare early. Tu Diem walked a few steps ahead. She was used to choosing supplies. She stopped at stalls selling cakes, leaves, and dried goods. Each item she selected was just enough, nothing extra. Toan followed behind her, his eyes drawn more to prices than to products. He slowed at several stalls, suggesting that some things could be bought later. His voice was not harsh, but his caution was unmistakable. A vendor casually remarked that many people were buying early this year, that waiting until closer to TET would only drive prices higher. The words echoed what the buyer had said in the morning, just phrased differently. Tu Diem heard it and said nothing. Toan nodded, his expression growing more conflicted. Further along, Tu Diem stopped at a stall selling simple decorations. Nothing large, just a small item that would make the yard feel more like TET. She picked it up and asked the price. Toan stood beside her. He did not say no, but he did not agree either. He looked at the item, then at the flow of people passing by. That brief hesitation was enough. Tu Diem placed the item back where it had been. She did not complain. She did not ask why. She simply moved on. But from that moment, something shifted between them. Not distance, but weight. Each of them carried their own thoughts while continuing down the same path. After finishing their shopping, they headed home. On the way, they met a neighbor. Hearing about the market and the longan prices, the neighbor gave a faint smile. Preparing for TET is the right thing to do. But worrying too much takes away the joy. The comment took no sides, yet it left both of them silent. Back at home, Tu Diem laid out the TET supplies on the table, placing each item neatly in its place. Toan stood watching for a moment, then opened an old notebook. He turned a few pages and began calculating expenses. Fertilizer, seedlings, roof repairs, costs that had been put off for a long time. He spoke through each one calmly, without complaint or blame. Tu Diem sat across from him and listened until he finished. Then she spoke. "I'm not afraid of lacking money. I'm afraid of making the wrong decision." The sentence was short, but it landed directly. Toan fell silent. He feared responsibility. He feared that if he chose wrong, everything would fall on his shoulders. In the afternoon, the buyer returned as promised. He asked for a decision. Toan stood in the yard, looking at the newly planted flowers and the TET items they had just bought. Tu Diem stood beside him. She did not push. She said only one clear thing. If we sell today, it will be out of fear, not belief. Toan asked for one more day. He did not sell, but he did not decide to keep either. The buyer nodded and rode away. The yard grew quiet once more. The question remained, hanging there, waiting for tomorrow. The afternoon passed more slowly than Toan expected. After the buyer left, the yard returned to its quiet state, but it no longer felt light the way it had in the morning. Tu Diem said nothing more. She tidied up the TET bags, placing them neatly in a corner of the table, then went to wash her hands. Every movement was normal, yet Toan noticed she moved more slowly. He sat down on the porch step and looked toward the longan trees behind the house. The rose stood still, unchanged, but in his mind, everything remained unsettled. One day, just asking for one more day. It was not a decision yet, only a pause to buy time. Tu Diem returned with a kettle. She poured water and placed a glass in front of Toan. They sat side by side without speaking for a long while. The air was not tense, but it was not comfortable either. It felt like both of them knew something was unresolved, and neither wanted to be the first to speak. After some time, Tu Diem spoke softly. Maybe we should go back to the market once more. There are still a few small things we haven't bought. Her tone was light, not urging. Toan nodded. He stood and picked up the keys. It was not just about shopping. He needed to step outside again to think in a different space. The afternoon market was less crowded than at noon, but not empty. Vendors were beginning to rearrange their stalls. Shoppers moved more slowly. The urgency had faded, but the feeling of preparing for TET was still present. Tu Diem walked more slowly than she had earlier. She stopped at familiar stalls, asking again about prices she had checked before. She did not buy right away. She only asked. Toan walked beside her. This time, he did not mention prices. He watched how carefully she considered each purchase, how her eyes lingered when vendors talked about rising costs and cautious buyers. They stopped at a stall selling leaves for wrapping cakes. The vendor said leaves were harder to find this year and prices might go up. Tu Diem asked a few questions, then bought exactly the amount they needed. Nothing extra. Toan stood beside her, not objecting, not pushing. He suddenly realized that from the beginning, Tu Diem had never chosen anything beyond what they could manage. A few steps later, they reached the decoration stall from earlier. The item Tu Diem had put down at noon was still there. The vendor recognized her and asked if she had come back for it. Tu Diem looked at the item for a moment. She did not pick it up right away. She turned to Toan. She did not ask, she only looked at him. Toan understood that look. It was not a demand and not a complaint. It was a quiet question. What about now? He looked at the item, then at the thinning crowd in the market. He thought of the morning, the buyer's words, the notebook, the request for one more day. He nodded. He did not say much. Tu Diem picked up the item and paid. Her movement was neither excited nor hesitant. It was simply the act of buying something they had decided they could afford. But to Toan, it was a small, clear sign. On the way home, they spoke little. The motorbike moved slowly. The breeze was light. Toan thought about selling the longan. He thought about why the worry weighed on him so heavily. It was not only about TET money. It was about carrying responsibility for every decision in the household. He was used to carrying it. But over time, the weight had grown heavier. Back home, the sky had darkened. Tu Diem took out the decoration and placed it on the table. She did not hang it yet, just placed it there. Toan noticed but said nothing. He went inside and opened the old notebook again. This time, he did not add new numbers. He simply reread what was already written. Tu Diem stood by the doorway and watched him. Then she spoke, very slowly. "I don't want you to decide everything alone." The sentence was quiet, but different from the ones before. It was not about money, and not about selling or keeping. It was about sharing. Toan looked up at her. For the first time that day, he spoke clearly about his fear. He said he was afraid that if he chose wrong, everything would fall on his shoulders. He was not afraid of hardship. He was afraid of disappointing the people he cared about. Tu Diem listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat across from him. She said, "I don't need you to always be right. I just need us to carry it together." The sentence was short, but it left Toan silent for a long time. Night came. No one mentioned the buyer again. No one spoke about the final decision. Together, they arranged the TET supplies. They tried hanging the decoration they had bought, then took it down, deciding to finish it another day. Everything moved slowly, without rush. Before going to bed, Toan stepped into the yard and looked once more at the flowers. Tu Diem stood beside him. Neither spoke. This time, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt like a pause long enough to breathe. The decision had not been made yet, but Toan knew that tomorrow he would not have to make it alone.
Sau khi trồng hoa xong, một ngày chuẩn bị Tết của Toàn và Từ Diễm tưởng chừng yên ổn thì bị xáo trộn bởi tin giá nhãn có thể rớt. Toàn lo lắng về tiền bạc và trách nhiệm, cân nhắc việc bán sớm để có sự an tâm trước mắt. Từ Diễm thì thận trọng hơn, sợ những quyết định vội vàng vì nỗi lo sẽ để lại hậu quả lâu dài. Cả hai cùng đi chợ sắm Tết, nơi từng món đồ, từng lần chần chừ đều phản ánh sự khác biệt trong suy nghĩ. Những cuộc trò chuyện ngắn, những khoảng im lặng kéo dài khiến căng thẳng âm ỉ suốt cả ngày. Đến chiều tối, dù chưa đưa ra quyết định cuối cùng, Toàn lần đầu thừa nhận nỗi sợ phải gánh mọi trách nhiệm một mình. Từ Diễm khẳng định cô không cần anh luôn đúng, chỉ cần cùng nhau chịu trách nhiệm. Ngày khép lại trong lặng lẽ, mở ra một lựa chọn còn bỏ ngỏ cho ngày mai.